Grand Rising. This is Sean Speaks with Up Talk My Life. And today I have a special guest with me, Dr. Anthony Pinn from Rice University. He is a professor of religious studies at Rice University. He lives here in the Houston, Texas area. And I am so glad to have him here. Thank you so much, Dr. Pinn, for being a guest on the Up Talk My Life podcast.
Oh, my pleasure. Thanks for the invitation.
Thank you. Thank you. All right. So some people, if you're in the Houston area, you may have heard of Dr. Pinn, but some people may not have heard of you, Dr. Pinn. Can you at least kind of tell us about yourself a little bit?
Where do you want me to start?
Let's start. You know what? Let's do a little background. Let's go background. Where did you grow up?
Well, I grew up in Buffalo, New York. Spent the first 18 years of my life in Buffalo, and from Buffalo I went to New York City as a college student, and from New York to Cambridge, Massachusetts to do graduate work. And after I got the PhD, I moved to Minnesota for my first teaching job at Macalester College, and from Macalester College to Houston, Texas, and Rice University.
Wow. Okay, so you are definitely an academic. Let's back up. Let's talk about the degrees that you have. Now, you went to Columbia first. What degree did you get from there?
Bachelor of Arts. I'm majored in sociology and minored in religion.
Got you. Then you went to Harvard, correct?
Yes.
And what degrees did you get at Harvard?
I have a Master of Divinity from the Divinity School at Harvard, and then a Master's and PhD from the Graduate School of Arts and Sciences.
Okay, all right. And then from there, you started your professor career, right? Your teaching career. Okay.
Yeah.
Now, I saw a book. Well, it actually was a YouTube heading, which is what caught my attention with you. And the title was how a good. Well, let's go back. You were 12 years old when you became a minister, correct?
Yeah, I was young. So I grew up in the church. Initially, we attended church with my grandfather, Baptist Church in Lackawanna, New York. It's right outside of Buffalo. It's where Bethlehem Steel was located.
Okay.
But with time, my mother decided that was not the location for us, that she didn't want us in a church where the opportunities for women were artificially restricted.
Okay. So from there, she moved you to another church, right?
Right. We moved
That's
to
more welcoming to women.
Right. A non-denominational church closer to our home in Buffalo.
Okay. And there, were you asked by a minister, what did you want to do when you grow up? What did you say?
Well, yeah, it was a small church. So the minister in charge was also my Sunday school teacher. And he went around during one Sunday morning, asked everyone what they wanted to be. And I said I wanted to be a preacher. I wasn't quite certain why, but his response was, okay, we start next Sunday. So at a very young age, childhood was over for me within this church. I was sitting in the pulpit. I was lining hymns. I was providing the prayers. I was opening the doors of the church. And then with some time, I moved from doing those sorts of activities to preaching.
Okay. And how old were you when you did your first sermon?
I was probably about 12, 13, somewhere in there.
Okay.
So I was young. I couldn't vote, but I was preaching.
Okay. You couldn't vote, but you were preaching. And so you were responsible for the souls of the congregation.
Right. I couldn't vote, so I had no real participation in the political life of the nation, but I was telling people where their soul was going.
Okay. And what I found interesting in your story was that you were at this age, you were preaching, then you went to a Christian-based high school, and then from there you wanted to go to a secular university. And the pastor of your church, I think, had an opportunity in New York. So you followed your pastor and you went to Columbia in New York. But there you had sort of a transcendent, maybe getting that word. Something happened in Columbia with you. What is that happened in Columbia?
Well, it wasn't that smooth.
Okay.
The development for me was over the course of time. So I went to Columbia having attended a rather evangelical Christian high school. It was a feeder program for universities like Bob Jones University.
Okay.
Right? So extremely conservative, not very good on issues of race, gender, and class.
Okay.
Critical thinking was not valued. So I moved from that context to Columbia, where it was all about critical engagement. People did not have the same perspective on scripture, for example, that I held. And I'm attending this church in Bedford-Stuyvesant in Brooklyn. I'm on the ministerial staff, and what I was learning in the classroom, people I was encountering, did not necessarily line up with what I believed theologically.
Okay.
And so over the course of my years at Columbia, it became much more difficult to find anything valuable in the theology that I held. So for example, I had been trained to believe that people who did not hold to my same faith stance were hellbound. They could not be good people, right? That if you did not believe in God, if you were not born again, if you were not sanctified, your moral and ethical outlook was tainted. But I was encountering people who did not believe what I believed, but many of them treated me better than the folks in the church.
Wow.
And they had no concerns over where their soul was going, even if they even believed there was a soul, right? So this was creating a kind of dissonance for me. And this is, I was in New York as crack cocaine is gaining ground. So we're losing folks. And I'm encountering young people who are finding it easier to map out their funerals than to think about a bright future. And what I offered theologically did not resolve any issues. So I found it increasingly difficult to be involved in church. I still wanted to be involved in ministry at that point, but my perception of ministry was radically changing. And so my model was becoming someone like Adam Clayton Powell Jr., for whom the church was an opportunity to affect the life circumstances of folks. So I was moving in that direction. I was talking less about personal salvation and more about the material obligations of Christians. But I knew that there were only certain types of questions I could ask, because Reverend Pinn was supposed to have answers, not questions. And so still being interested in ministry, I knew I needed to leave New York because I needed to be someplace where I could think, where I could value questions, and nobody was probing me for answers.
So you felt like you needed to separate yourself sort of from that base understanding that you grew up in, right? Is that one of the reasons why you chose to go from Columbia to Harvard when you say you had to sort of be able to think?
I wanted to be somewhere where ministry was not central, that it was about the life of the mind. Because I had questions about theology that I needed to ask, and I needed to ask those in a way that didn't immediately take us to the question of, well, how do you preach this?
Okay.
And so I decided on Harvard Divinity School, and while I was there, I was working on the MDiv, because again, initially I was still interested in ministry, but ministry that was earthbound, that allowed you to get your hands dirty on behalf of people.
Okay, so even when you made the shift to Harvard, you still were not really trying to let go of your desire for what we call ministry, right? So
right.
You still have, so you were still struggling from that dissonance of something has come to the forefront of your mind that's different from what you thought was true.
Yeah, I'm rethinking the nature of ministry.
Rethinking the nature of ministry.
But still wanting to be involved. So I'm working at a church in Roxbury.
Okay.
And across the street from this church was a park. And this park, right, this is still at the age of crack cocaine. So there's some nasty things happening in this park. And I'm asking the ministers at the church, well, what do we do? And the response was, too often, let the people get happy with you on Sunday.
Let's stop there. Let the people get happy with you on Sunday. So was this supposed to be the answer to the problem that you saw across the street?
Right. That rather than looking at the material, the socioeconomic and political problems fueling activities in this park, I was being told, give the folks something spiritual.
Give them something.
In other words, kind of spiritually blind them to what's taking place. spiritually blind them to what's killing their kids.
Wait on somebody else to fix it. Some entity outside.
Well, not even that. Just, we don't need to think about that. Sunday is about folks renewing their souls.
It's about us being happy, getting our happy back. Gotcha. Now,
and so it reached a point for me where I just couldn't be involved anymore. That I did not believe that this faith was of any material good. That I did not believe it anymore. I had strong doubts about the existence of a God, moving in the direction of atheism, and I was not going to be a hypocrite. I was not going to be in the pulpit preaching what I did not believe. So I left the church, surrendered my ordination, and decided to move in a different direction.
So that is how a kid that grew up as a Christian became a youth minister, wrote a book, God's Obituary, How Good Methodists Became a Better Atheist. So and that was over years of, basically you had to work out your own dissonance, and that took you away from the Christian faith. Yeah.
Well, at the end of the day, it wasn't personal, right? So lots of folks get confused and they say, well, Pinn left the church because he was disillusioned. He prayed and didn't get something, right? Or something, but no, life was pretty good for me. It wasn't personal. It was, I did not see this faith having any useful consequences for folks who suffered the most, right? The marginalized, I did not see it having a positive effect. And for me, it wasn't simply because the Christian faith wasn't being exercised properly. It was because religion, theism, did not have that kind of value.
Tell me this, Dr. Pinn, why do people take it personal when you sort of decide to give up religion, or when you find that it's not useful to just your human existence? Why is it that quote unquote church folks get offended by that? They take it personal. Why is that?
It's simple, because in me saying this religion isn't truthful, right? That this religion is myth. For them, I'm saying that they have made a mistake, right? That what they value most, what they understand as of fundamental importance, isn't very useful. So they see my stepping away as a critique of their staying.
And they assume that you haven't had to deal with that same sort of realization for yourself. When you started to realize that, wait a minute, this is not that useful, right? If somebody comes, I think you had said something about somebody when you were in college, the youth would talk to you about, or you would talk to them about sex, and your advice would be, just remember, do whatever you decide to do it knowing that Jesus is in the room. And you started to question that and ask yourself, how is that really helpful? What have I really given these people to really help them in their daily life with struggling with, let's say, the question of sex and whether you should have sex and all of that type of stuff?
It was a twisted logic, right? That nothing that I had been trained to understand and promote valued us as embodied beings. All of our natural desires, we problematized.
What do you mean by that? All of our natural desires we problematize. What do you mean by that?
The sexual urge, the desire for intimacy is natural, but within the context of my training and the context of this faith, it was problematized, right? That it did not point to something that was natural, that was beautiful, but it pointed to the potentiality for sin. Right, and that we made use of biblical narratives that are inconsistent with our historical and cultural moment.
Gotcha. Okay, all righty. So it's literally as if really religion sort of started us off in the negative, right? We are sinful, we are no good, we are bad. And so our whole entire journey should be to try to undo that, but we really can't undo that because we really need a God to do it for us. But we live in a life where we have to make actual decisions and we have to think things through. But instead of focusing on sort of that logic and the reason and trying to figure out how to solve problems, we surrender and silence our mind and we wait on God to fix it, right?
Yeah, it's a tainted logic that everything is problematized by original sin. We can get nothing right because of this concept of original sin. So yes, we spend our lives trying to undo this original sin.
Who created the original sin?
Well, if you follow the biblical account, the original sin is the result of human rebellion.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay, recorded in the book. What happened with, I know if you grew up kind of like the way I think you grew up, which is how I grew up, where the Bible was the infallible, inherent word of God. When you got to Columbia and Harvard, especially probably Harvard, what did the Bible now become? Was it the inherent, infallible word of God, or was it just literature?
It was just literature. But if we're honest about it, even those who are devoted Christians are selective when it comes to their read and embrace of Scripture. Right? So the Bible, for example, does not condemn slavery. But how many Black churches make that argument? Right? That there are inconsistencies. There is a safeguarding of misery and injustice in Scripture, but Christians read against that when it's convenient.
It's a picking and choosing.
Right, and so Black Christians tend to read the Bible as if they are the children of Israel. But our history would suggest that perhaps Blacks are best represented by the Canaanites, the Moabites, and the Hittites, those who take a beating.
Gotcha. Now, you wrote I think your most recent book is on color blindness. I think that's your most recent book, right?
Well, there's some others after that, but that's the most recent one dealing explicitly with humanism.
Gotcha. Now, you defined in one podcast I watched of you, you defined humanism as a philosophy of life without belief in God or gods, and hold humans fully accountable and responsible for conditions in life that entails an ethic and a sense of what we are to do, and we don't assume any other external help. It's humans trying to make their way in the world in relationship to other forms of life. Now, I love how you define humanism there, because sometimes, humanism, I think is like that fluid word that can mean a lot of different things. Atheism, and especially in the African American community, you say atheism, people, we sort of respond, we think of, oh my goodness, I'm gonna burn in hell, right? But let's talk about humanism, right? I know I just defined kind of what you said humanism is, but I think sometimes people who identify as white sometimes think that they are the creators of humanism, and they don't realize that humanism been around before, that term white was even in existence. What is humanism in even more simplistic way than the way you defined it?
It's a historically grounded, experience-sensitive approach to living.
Exactly. Yeah, it's living life and having experiences and understanding yourself in connection with what's going on around you.
And no transhistorical claims, right? That it's all within the confines of human history, that it's material and experiential.
Yeah. But religion sort of makes you afraid to experience life. And if you do experience life, you can't bring anything organic to it. You have to then go and sort of fit it in the mold of the Bible. So if you had a certain feeling, you got to go look at the Bible, and the Bible said it's wrong. Now you got to beat yourself up because you shouldn't feel this way, or you shouldn't think this way because the Bible said something, even though the Bible is full of straight contradictions, right? So why is it though that we don't have more African Americans in sort of the quote unquote humanistic movement?
Well, we have lots.
Okay.
Right, we have lots. And so I want to say a couple of things. One, I don't want to make a blanket statement concerning all Black Christians, because not all Black Christians are conservative. Not all Black Christians take the Bible literally. But even those who are more progressive, more liberal in their outlook, are lodged within a tradition that often fights against that. It's like trying to run a marathon with your shoelaces tied together, right? That it's not necessarily the case that this tradition consistently supports a more progressive agenda.
Okay.
So I would say that in terms of African Americans who are humanists, one, it depends on who's counting.
Okay.
And it seems to me that you get that one thing to consider is the growing number of African Americans who claim no religious tradition.
Okay. And would you consider them as part of the nuns, like the movement?
Yeah,
of
I mean,
nuns?
so not all of the nuns are humanist.
Okay.
Right? But we're still talking about a group that has moved beyond traditional forms of religiosity, right? So that growing number of African Americans who claim no particular religious affiliation is consistently important. I would also argue that within the context of Black churches, you have Black humanists often hiding out.
Absolutely. I totally agree with you on that. Yeah.
Because it seems to me that if you think about the evolution of Black churches, after the civil rights movement, there's a decrease in membership. And this affects churches throughout the various denominations in the United States. There's a decrease in terms of Black churches. There isn't an uptick until the 80s. And this is when Black folks who have played by the civil rights rules, who have moved to the right neighborhoods, who speak English in a way that is acceptable, have gone to the right schools, gotten the right jobs, being told that this was the way to secure the American dream, still encounter racial nastiness, still encounter anti-Black racism. And they have given up so much of their cultural selves. And so you get Black folks moving back into the churches, but not all of them moving back because they believe, but because this is a place where they don't have to explain why they're mad. They can socialize and they can network. And if the sermon is the price they pay, then so be it. So humanists have hung out in these churches. Right?
So there may be more humanists in the church than we know, right? It's just that they may have a fear of, really speaking against some of the harms of religion.
If you are Black, you are living in the context of a society that is premised upon anti-Black racism. If you're a Black woman, add gender to that dynamic. If you're a Black, add class. So you already are at risk. Why would you add to that risk by publicly announcing yourself to be a humanist or atheist, right? So there are reasons why Black folks don't publicly announce this, but it doesn't mean they aren't humanists, they aren't atheists, they aren't free thinkers. There is just reason not to make that public. But I'd also say we have to be mindful of the growing visible presence of Black humanists and atheists, the increase in the number of organizations formed by Black humanists and atheists.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. So that's a good segue into, I know you've been watching the news like many of us have, with the George Floyd, Ahmaud, all of, the atrocities that has just been going on recently. Let's talk about white privilege, racism, and white supremacy. I think in your book, Colorblind, you make it a point to understand that white privilege is actually the cause, and racism is a symptom.
Well,
so
white supremacy.
Yeah, white supremacy.
Supremacy.
So talk to us about that. Explain to us about white privilege, because a lot of time, a lot of people don't want to admit that there is a white privilege here in the United States. And even if they admit it, that's as far as they want to go, right? But what exactly, when you say white, or when we say white privilege, what do we mean by that?
Well, in simple terms, it means that white folks are conditioned and encouraged to understand themselves as rightly occupying time and space, that anything of value that is available to them, right? It's a certain posture towards the world that they rightfully—
assumption that they belong.
not only belong, that this is theirs. That the best of what the United States has to offer was constructed, was built for their benefit.
Okay. Okay.
And they don't even have to speak this. That's the power of it, right? It operates whether they acknowledge it or not.
And they benefit from it, whether they acknowledge it or not.
And folks make the mistake, they make it too simple. This isn't simply about who owned slaves, right? So the idea that whites can deny accountability because they and their ancestors didn't own slaves isn't the point. They benefited from slave labor.
Yeah, they benefited from slave labor, and a country was built on slave labor.
For their advantage.
For their advantage, yeah.
Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness was framed in terms of white bodies.
Yeah, yeah. So do you think that if there's because I know you, in your book, you talk a lot about not falling prey to wanting to have, color blindness or sameness, right? And I actually agree with you on that 1,000%. But the question I think I have is, how do you merge? This country definitely was built on division. How do you merge the division, right? But not fall prey to sameness? Because I think that part of the problem when you talk about politics and you talk about religion is that you have that merger, right? Religion requires you to come to Christ and be one with Christ, right? But yet again, there's still division there, because you go through the Bible, you got all of these groups of ites of people, and the whole goal is to, one group is better than another group. How do you merge? How do you deal with not wanting sameness, right? Because I think you should appreciate differences, but at the same time wanting people who benefit from white privilege to let that go, right? Because you're asking for them to give up an advantage, are you not?
Of course.
Right. But what are we asking of Black people in that struggle as well, right? What are we asking of us?
To acknowledge our value.
Wow. To acknowledge our value. See, I was hoping you said that, and you said it, because in my own journey, one of the things that I had to sort of come to an awareness was my own value. But I didn't realize that I had been dismissing my own value. So, okay, so let's talk about sameness. When in your book, Colorblind, what's the full title? Because I don't want to mess up the title.
When colorblindness isn't the answer, humanism is the challenge of race.
Okay, colorblindness isn't the answer. I want you to explain in your wise words, why is colorblindness not the answer?
Well, colorblindness denies the problem, and it maintains the normative. It maintains whiteness as normative. So when white folks say, I don't see color, they are leaving in place the structures of life that disadvantage, right? Because they are rendering themselves the norm. And so it's, for me, this plays out in a variety of ways. And so the catchphrase people of color normalizes whiteness. Because when we say that, we mean everybody but white people. Those are the only ones not raced. And we know that is not the case. What we're actually talking about when we talk about anti-Black racism, when we talk about a George Floyd, what we're actually talking about are people of a despised color. Not simply people of color, as if whites are not racialized. Their racialization privileges them. Our racialization demonizes us.
But do they all really know that they are race? Could it be that?
That's the point. They don't have to know it. Right? There's no disadvantage in not knowing it, right? Because who they are is considered the norm. They don't need to acknowledge this. It's other folks who are continuously made sensitive to their racialization.
Mm, okay, okay. Because I was actually invited to a webinar, and the title of the webinar is how white women could help to learn to talk to women of color. And at first, the title didn't really bother me that much. But then I kind of started thinking about it. It's like how white women can talk to women of color. Are we not all women? Right? So to me, the presumption in there is that white women is the norm and people of color sort of are the exceptions, right? Whereas we're just really, how do we talk to each other, right? How do we embrace whatever our differences are without needing to erase the differences, right? Without needing for you to sort of forget about who you are and become more like I am. But isn't that what America is really all about? Is forget your past, come over to America, let's all boil in the melting pot and become
No,
one?
not really.
Okay.
If that were the case, then you wouldn't have African Americans, for example, being disproportionately targeted for death, right? If that were actually the practice, then the class structure would look very different.
Mm. Okay. Okay.
Right? I mean, and you go on and on. If you think in terms of the Latinx experience, if you think in terms of Native Americans, nothing about the history of the United States suggests an appreciation for difference.
So why do we say that though?
Well, we say it, but what undergirds it is the rendering of white as normative, and the rest of us are encouraged to spend our time, spend our lives trying to fit that model of whiteness, to behave in a way that doesn't render whites uncomfortable.
And what does that do to us psychologically?
Render them uncomfortable.
I'm sorry. What does that do to us psychologically?
It destroys us. We don't value ourselves, right? And so we end up buying into conversations. You're not like the others.
Yeah, I've gotten that, and I don't think people realize it's like, okay, you're not like the other ones, right? But why? Okay, so how do we all help each other? What do we do as a people, and what can they do as a people?
One, we have to recognize our value and say no to injustice as loud and as persistent as we can. That one of the things that becomes a value is exposing these issues, right? Disrupting,
challenging
the narrative.
Yeah. So really, we have to do sort of what this George Floyd and a host of other atrocities that has occurred is we've got to start to challenge the very system that perpetuates sort of that white privilege, and we can't ever get silence again, right? Because it took years to build up the white privilege, and it's going to take years to deconstruct it. You can start with, of course, acknowledging it, but you cannot stop there, right? You can't. The work doesn't stop just by acknowledging that there is a white privilege.
And doing that with all of the tools available to us, right? This persistent critique of injustice, this putting a spotlight on this injustice, not allowing it to be rendered normative.
What about those people who sort of are becoming sort of honorary whiteness? You talk about honorary whiteness in the book. What do you mean by that?
Well, again, what we have been encouraged to do in the context of the United States is remodel ourselves, reconceive ourselves in ways that make white people comfortable.
So it's time for us to make
present ourselves in a way that allow white folks to see themselves reflected.
Okay.
And so one of the things we have to do, it seems to me, is rethink our understanding of difference. We tend to think about difference as a problem to solve, as opposed to seeing difference as an opportunity.
Okay. I like that. I like the term, you use the term rethought in the book when you were talking about those that came from England into Americas. They had to sort of rethought or rethink themselves. And I think I like the way you phrased that. And I sort of kind of apply that same terminology to us as African Americans in this American society. It's like it's time for us to start to sort of rethink ourselves, right? How can we start to rethink ourselves in a more beneficial way as a group within America?
Well, there are again, I go back to exercising, performing an appreciation of ourselves. So we don't, for example, talk about good hair anymore.
Okay, I like that. Yeah, stop that. Gotcha.
Right. So we have to be mindful, and as you said, this is something that develops over the course of centuries, and it has been so normalized that we aren't even aware of it. And so it involves an effort to become sensitized to the ways in which we've been encouraged to dislike ourselves.
To dislike ourselves, yeah, yeah. I have a girlfriend of mine that's writing a book, and it's entitled "Chew That Shit," and it's really about just, you know, your example of, you know, of good hair, bad hair. You know, we didn't even realize we were embracing a dislike about ourselves in that terminology, or in seeing ourselves and thinking, oh, my hair is bad, your hair is good, and perpetuating that verbiage about ourselves, right? We got to start to, you know, like ourselves, love ourselves just as we are. And so I totally agree with you. I'm going to say a few phrases, and I just kind of want you to give me whatever your first thoughts about. Okay. People of color.
Normalizes whiteness.
We are all oppressed.
Clouds the issue. Doesn't allow us to address injustice.
I am colorblind.
A lie.
I am uncomfortable.
Good.
We've had a Black president.
And we've had, and that did nothing to change white privilege policies.
You know, I pulled those right from your book. I thought those were excellent, because I think that they're good conversational pieces, because I've heard them all. I've heard them all, and I sort of can distinctively tell when I heard them a long time ago, and my response to hearing stuff like that, and the way I would respond to them now, which is exactly how you responded to them, because I see it differently. Mm-hmm. But this is the thing, though, Dr. Pinn, and help me on this. I see it differently now because I gave up religion. And why is that, if you have an opinion?
Well, I don't want to say that the only way to get to this is to be religion free. I just know too many folks who embrace Islam, who embrace Christianity, etc., who understand and critique this system. I think for some of us, breaking free of Christianity gave us an opportunity to appreciate and refine our critical thinking skills.
Exactly. Yeah. And that's what I was saying, for me, right? It was for me, I had to break free. I'm not necessarily saying everybody else have to break free, right? But I don't think I got to this place where I'm at now. I don't think I would have gotten there if I would have continued to hold on to my religious belief. I literally had that same journey that you had. I think a little different. I think I probably became more religious, trying not to let go. Mm-hmm. You know, so, okay. In light of all of the atrocities that have occurred, what's your advice with regards to, you know, police brutality in the American system? What is it that we could start to do within the system, the political system, to stop sort of this police brutality that seems to be prevalent, and without this, you know, even with videos, people were getting away with it. What are your thoughts about that?
Well, first, we have to recognize that this is a systemic problem. right? And one way to do that is to understand natural links between slave patrols and current policing strategies. Both understand Black bodies as a problem, right? And so it seems to me that this isn't, we don't fix this by simply pointing out bad cops, although we ought to do that and they ought to be held accountable. It requires a rethinking of the larger system. So for example, one of the things that needs to happen is community accountability.
Okay. What do you mean by that?
To determine what is good and bad policing.
Okay. Community accountability.
Understanding that accountability is part of this process.
But how do we practically get that into the police system? I get the community responsibility, right? But if you're going to do that, you got to build that community sort of watchdog into the system, right? How do you merge those two, right?
You vote for people who agree with these policies, right? You vote for folks who are in line.
So basically, one of the agendas that we should have on there, especially as African American people, is that, hey, politician, you have to support changes to the rules of engagement between police officers and citizens, right?
Or find a new job.
Okay, yeah. And I think that, to me, that's one of the things I keep saying. I said, that's number one. That should be number one agenda, right? Let's change the rules of engagement, right? Because it's a system problem, right? And then only over time, when you change the system, do you change behavior, right? I like Jeremiah Kamara calls it precepts, right? The precepts of how we think about how they think about us and how we think about them. That occurred over a long period of time, right? And the law backed it up, right? So now we got to change the law to change behavior. And changing the rules of engagement is one. To me, I think that politicians that are on the ballot now, they need to add some agenda regarding the rules of engagement between police officers and regular citizens. So that's one of the number one things that they can do. All right, Dr. Pinn, one more point I want to make that you made in the book that I thought was interesting. And I'm not going to pronounce it right, so I want you to pronounce it right. It used to be that on the dollar used to have e pluribus unum. Pronounce it?
E pluribus unum.
Okay. And that means out of many, one, right? And then in 1956, I believe, President Eisenhower changed it to "In God We Trust." What are your thoughts about that?
Well, one, it shows that this idea of "in God we trust" is not intrinsic to U.S. thinking. That was done in response to what was perceived as the growing threat of communism.
Okay. How changing that though? You say that was done in response to the growing threat of communism, but how did that fortify? What was the fortification by changing it to "In God We Trust"?
I'm not certain I know what you mean.
Okay, so you're saying that the change of the Latin phrase to "In God We Trust" was done in response to communism, but how did that help? How about changing that on the dollar bill? How did that help?
Well, it was political leaders making a clear distinction between the U.S. and the growing Soviet Union, right? It was making this distinction, but folks have looked at this and assumed that the United States is and always has been a Christian nation, which is not the case.
Okay, I got you, because I know I grew up thinking that America was based in Christianity, but you're saying that's not true. And the phrase going from the Latin phrase to "In God We Trust," that wasn't done to 1956, and many of us don't really know that, not consciously anyway.
The dominant thought is democracy, right? That the United States was supposed to be this grand experiment in democracy. We've not lived that out.
Not at all.
But that was the framing.
Gotcha. Wow. Okay, I could dive so deep with you. I really can, because I love reading your book. It's so much there that I want to talk about, but I'm gonna have to leave that for another day because I want to be respectful of your time. I so appreciate you taking out this time during the day to do this podcast with me.
My pleasure.
Thank you so much. You need to check out Dr. Pinn's work, his many, many books, and just the way that he thinks, especially how he just breaks down humanism. Don't be afraid of his work. His work is going to enlighten you and expand you and grow you. Um, uh, Ashe, free thinkers, Ashe, may what you say manifest in your life today and every day. Ashe.